On March 17, 1943, in a quiet, wood-paneled office in Berlin, a German admiral held a report that seemed utterly, completely impossible. It was a single sheet of paper, a simple summary of raw intelligence, but its contents were more explosive than a 1,000-pound bomb. The report didn't describe a new superweapon or a secret army. It described a factory, an American factory, an entire ocean away, that was projected to soon be capable of producing a 4-engine heavy bomber every 60 minutes. To the men of the German High Command, it was a joke, a piece of American propaganda so absurd, so over the top, it was laughable. But to the spies who risked their lives to gather that information, it was something else entirely. It was a death sentence written in numbers. It was the day they knew with chilling mathematical certainty that the war was lost. This is the story of the devastating truth that was too terrifying for Adolf Hitler to believe, and how the denial of a single verifiable fact sealed the fate of the Third Reich. In the heart of the Nazi war machine, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris was an oddity. As the head of the Abwehr, German military intelligence, he was a man who lived and breathed cold, hard facts. Unlike the fanatics and ideologues who populated Hitler's inner circle, Canaris was an old-school professional. He was a career naval officer, a patriot from a different era, who saw the world not through the warped lens of Nazi ideology, but through the clear glass of strategic reality. His loyalty was to Germany, and his duty was to provide the unvarnished truth, no matter how ugly. His organization, the Abwehr, was a sprawling network of agents, analysts, and informants stretching across the entire globe. They were the eyes and ears of the German military. In the early years of the war, the Abwehr had been a key to Germany's blitzkrieg victories, delivering the critical intelligence that let the Wehrmacht outmaneuver and outsmart its opponents. But by early 1943, the mood in Berlin was changing. The war wasn't a series of triumphant victory parades anymore. The disaster at Stalingrad had been a brutal, soul-crushing shock to the system. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet war machine was grinding back with terrifying, relentless force. In North Africa, American and British forces were squeezing the life out of Rommel's famed Afrika Korps. The tide was beginning to turn.
And yet, at the very top, a dangerous, delusional sense of invincibility lingered. Hitler, holed up in his Wolf's Lair headquarters, was becoming more and more detached from the real world, surrounded by sycophants and yes-men who filtered out bad news and fed his delusions of grandeur. He truly believed the German war effort was a matter of sheer will. The German soldier was racially superior. German science was unbeatable. Victory wasn't just a goal, it was destiny. Into this echo chamber of self-deception, Admiral Canaris was about to pour a bucket of ice-cold water. He was a man who understood the grim, unforgiving arithmetic of modern war. He knew that this conflict wasn't just a clash of armies, but a collision of entire economies. It was a brutal equation of steel, oil, aluminum, and manpower. And from his perch at the center of a global intelligence web, he was starting to see numbers that absolutely terrified him. Numbers that suggested Germany wasn't just losing the production war, it was about to be buried by an industrial avalanche it couldn't even begin to imagine. The intelligence didn't arrive in a single dramatic flash. It was a slow, creeping dread, built piece by piece from a dozen different sources. It started as whispers, picked up by German agents in neutral countries like Switzerland and Sweden. A businessman just back from the United States spoke of a factory so vast it was said to have its own internal weather system. A diplomat in Washington reported on new American production targets that seemed to have an extra zero tacked on the end. A Swedish engineer sent a coded message about an aircraft assembly line that moved not with the careful pace of aviation manufacturing, but with the ruthless speed of automobile production. Individually, you could dismiss them as rumors or exaggeration. But as the reports flowed into the Abwehr headquarters on Berlin's Terpitzufer, Canaris's analysts began to see the terrifying pattern. They all told the same story. They all pointed to one specific place, a massive industrial complex in Michigan called Willow Run. And they all made the same ridiculous claim. The Ford Motor Company was applying automobile mass production techniques to the consolidated B-24 Liberator, a 4-engine heavy bomber. Their stated goal was to eventually roll one finished bomber off the assembly line. Not one a day, not one every few hours, one every single hour.
To the German military mind, this was simply impossible. A B-24 Liberator was a beast, an 18-ton behemoth of aluminum and steel with 4 massive engines, a 110-foot wingspan, and over 1.5 million individual parts. German factories, the pride of European engineering, took weeks, sometimes even months, to produce a comparable heavy bomber like the Heinkel HE-177. The very idea that the Americans, a nation mocked in Nazi propaganda as a chaotic, decadent, racially mixed society, could build such a complex weapon of war in 60 minutes wasn't just unbelievable, it was insulting. Canaris and his officers did the math. If the Americans could actually pull this off, 1 bomber an hour meant 24 a day, over 700 a month, from a single factory. At that time, the entire German aircraft industry was struggling to produce even a fraction of that number of heavy bombers. The spies confirmed the details. The information was vetted, cross-referenced. Even Japanese naval attachés, Germany's own allies, were sending back horrified reports on American production numbers with a tone of sheer, unadulterated dread. The data was solid. But how could this be? How could a workforce of what the Nazis considered inferior people, women, African Americans, immigrants, achieve this industrial miracle? How could a messy, chaotic democracy mobilize with such terrifying focus? In the Nazi worldview, strength came from racial purity and authoritarian control. America had neither. Therefore, the reports had to be a lie, a massive, brilliantly orchestrated deception campaign. The alternative was simply too horrible to consider. It meant the war was no longer a contest of soldiers or generals, it was a war of factories. And if this report from March 1943 was pointing to a real future, it meant Germany had already lost. As one of Canaris's top officers grimly put it after reviewing the data, if these numbers are correct, then Germany has already lost the war. It is no longer a question of willpower. It is a question of mathematics. Half a world away, the impossible was becoming very, very real. On a vast stretch of farmland in Ypsilanti, Michigan, a monster had risen from the earth. It was the Willow Run bomber plant, the physical embodiment of what President Franklin D. Roosevelt had called the arsenal of democracy. And there was nothing else like it on the planet. Designed by the legendary industrial architect Albert Kahn, the main building was a single room so vast it was called the most enormous room in the history of man. It stretched for over half a mile. To avoid paying taxes in 2 different counties, the L-shaped assembly line famously had to make a bizarre 90-degree turn, with partially built bombers rotating on giant custom-built turntables, a feature that became known as the tax turn. But the real revolution wasn't the building's size, it was the philosophy inside. Henry Ford and his notoriously tough production chief, Charles Sorensen, had made an arrogant, almost unbelievable promise. They would build airplanes just like they built Model Ts. The old guard of the established aircraft industry scoffed. "You can't expect a blacksmith to make a watch overnight," one executive sneered. Ford and Sorensen were about to prove them all wrong. They systematically deconstructed the B-24, a complex, hand-built aircraft, into thousands of smaller, manageable subassemblies. The genius was in the simplification. Each worker was trained for a single, repetitive task. One person drilled holes in a specific panel all day. Another riveted that same panel over and over and over. This allowed the plant's massive apprentice school to churn out thousands of new, semi-skilled workers every single week. And who were these workers? They were a direct, living contradiction of Nazi ideology. At its peak, Willow Run employed over 42,000 people. Nearly a third of them were women, the iconic Rosie the Riveters, who left their homes and kitchens to operate heavy rivet guns and welding torches. In fact, one of these women, Rose Monroe, became a real-life inspiration for the Rosie propaganda character after being discovered at the plant. The workforce was a vibrant tapestry of America. Over 9% of the workers were African American, and another 3% were classified as disabled, all working side by side on the line. They worked in 3 shifts, 6 days a week. Their collective effort was a relentless 24-hour hum of creation and purpose. This was the very mongrel society Hitler loved to mock in his speeches, and they were about to outproduce the so-called master race at a rate that defied belief. The early days were rough, plagued by tooling problems and logistical nightmares, earning the plant the derisive nickname Willow Run. But as 1943 rolled on, the great machine hit its stride. Raw materials flowed in one end, and out the other, an 18-ton heavy bomber emerged, fueled up and ready to fly. This wasn't propaganda. This was a new kind of warfare, a war of overwhelming industrial might. And America was unleashing a weapon the Third Reich had no answer for. While German scientists worked on futuristic rockets and jets, America was perfecting its most devastating weapon of all, the assembly line. Armed with this terrifying truth, Admiral Canaris faced his biggest challenge yet, penetrating the ideological fortress that surrounded Adolf Hitler. It was a wall built of arrogance, dogma, and willful ignorance. And its chief architect was the second most powerful man in Germany, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring. Göring was the head of the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force. A flamboyant, decorated World War I flying ace, he saw himself as the ultimate authority on all things related to air power. He was also profoundly corrupt, deeply egotistical, and living in a world of his own making. More than anyone else, Göring was responsible for creating and maintaining the myth of the Luftwaffe's invincibility. When Canaris and the Abwehr presented their findings on Willow Run, Göring's reaction wasn't concern, it wasn't alarm, it was laughter. The reports were dismissed out of hand. "Americans cannot build airplanes," he famously sneered. "They are very good at refrigerators and razor blades." And that wasn't just a throwaway line, it was a perfect, concise summary of the entire Nazi worldview. To them, Americans were a nation of shopkeepers, a decadent consumer society obsessed with comfort and convenience. They saw a mongrel race lacking the discipline, the martial spirit, and the unified will of the German people. The idea that such a culture could mass-produce a complex weapon like a heavy bomber was, in Göring's mind, simply preposterous. He dismissed the meticulously gathered intelligence as clumsy American propaganda designed to frighten them. You can imagine how maddening this must have been for Canaris. He was presenting a mathematical certainty to a man living in a fantasy. He tried to press the issue. His agents had specifics: the mile-long assembly line, the specialized tools, the sheer capital investment poured into the project. Göring wouldn't hear it. He and his inner circle had their own narrative, and it had become an article of faith. To question it wasn't just to question a military assessment, it was heresy. Plus, there was a personal reason for Göring's denial. For him to accept Canaris's report would be a devastating admission of his own failure. It would mean that his own intelligence services had missed the single most critical industrial development of the war. And it would mean that his beloved Luftwaffe was about to be swept from the skies by a tidal wave of enemy aircraft. And so the report went nowhere. It was buried under the immense weight of Hermann Göring's ego. The wall of denial stood firm. Canaris was left holding a truth that could save Germany, but with no one in a position of power willing to listen. The next step was the final one: to somehow get this information to the one man who mattered, the Führer himself. Presenting unwelcome facts in the Führer's headquarters was a strange and dangerous business. Whether at the Berghof in the Bavarian Alps or the Wolf's Lair in the gloomy forests of East Prussia, the atmosphere was oppressive and paranoid. Reality was whatever Adolf Hitler decreed it to be on any given day. Military briefings were less about honest strategic discussion and more about reinforcing whatever the Führer already wanted to believe. Into this theater of delusion, the facts from Willow Run were a ticking time bomb. Hitler's view of the United States was a bizarre, contradictory mix of contempt for its culture and a grudging respect for its sheer size. He saw it as a mongrel nation, crippled by racial impurity and secretly controlled by Jewish financiers. A country with no soul, no real history, and no martial tradition. When confronted with the production figures from the Abwehr, the projections of 1 bomber an hour, over 650 a month from a single plant, Hitler's reaction mirrored Göring's, but with an added layer of pure venom. This wasn't just a strategic miscalculation to him, it was a personal insult to his entire ideology. The numbers had to be inflated fantasies, Jewish propaganda, lies designed to undermine German morale. His own armaments minister, Albert Speer, a man who actually understood industrial production, would later admit in Allied interrogations that he knew if the Willow Run numbers were even half accurate, Germany was utterly doomed. But to say that out loud in Hitler's presence in 1943 would have been professional and likely literal suicide. So the Great Confrontation, the moment where truth could have changed history, never really happened. It was a collision between fact and dogma.
And in the Third Reich, dogma always won. The Admiral's warning was not just ignored, it was seen as a symptom of defeatism. The men who brought the truth were now seen as weak, their patriotism questioned. In Hitler's mind, the war was a test of will and blood, not of logistics and production schedules. A single piece of paper, representing the dangerous, painstaking work of dozens of spies, was brushed aside. It contained the most important strategic fact of the entire war. The enemy's industrial capacity was growing at an exponential rate that Germany couldn't hope to match. The decision was made not by a formal order, but by a stubborn, fanatical refusal to see. The truth was rejected. The spies were dismissed as fools. The Admiral was silenced. And in that moment of supreme ideological blindness, the fate of millions was sealed. The consequences of that denial were as brutal as they were inevitable. They came first as a distant rumble on the horizon, then as a terrifying roar that filled the skies over the Reich. Believing their own hype and dismissing the American threat, the German High Command made a series of disastrous strategic mistakes. They continued to funnel precious resources into Hitler's pet projects, the Wunderwaffen, or wonder weapons. The V-1 flying bomb and V-2 rocket, while technologically advanced, were strategically insignificant and did little to halt the Allied advance. The Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter was a revolution in aviation, but it arrived too late and in far too few numbers to make a difference. They didn't have time, because the prophecy of Willow Run was coming true. Throughout late 1943 and into 1944, the trickle of Allied bombers became a flood. The U.S. 8th Air Force, based in England, began its relentless daylight bombing campaign against the heart of Germany. And at the core of this aerial armada were the B-24 Liberators. The very planes rolling off the assembly line in Michigan were now blotting out the German sun. In February 1944, the Allies launched Big Week, an all-out concentrated assault on the German aircraft industry itself. Thousands of heavy bombers, many of them from Willow Run, pounded factories and airfields across Germany. The Luftwaffe rose to defend its home turf and was systematically annihilated. German pilots, however brave or skilled, were simply overwhelmed by the sheer numbers. For every German fighter that was shot down, there was only a trickle of replacements. For every American plane lost, 10 more were already crossing the Atlantic. It was a brutal, grinding war of attrition, exactly the kind of war Admiral Canaris had foreseen. The cities that Hermann Göring had once boasted would never be bombed were being systematically reduced to rubble. One frustrated Luftwaffe general, fed up with Göring's complete detachment from reality, wrote in his diary, "The Reichsmarshal lives in a fantasy. Yesterday, 1,000 American bombers destroyed Linz. He still insists they cannot have built so many aircraft." The B-24s that rolled out of the most enormous room in the history of NAN were now deconstructing the Third Reich, piece by piece. They shattered factories, tore up railway lines, and obliterated oil refineries. The German war machine, starved of fuel and replacement parts, began to grind to a halt. The unstoppable Wehrmacht was being pounded into submission by the output of a single factory its leaders had laughed at a year earlier. So what happened to the man who tried to sound the alarm? For Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, the price of telling the truth was steep. As the war turned decisively against Germany, his sober, realistic warnings marked him as a man not to be trusted. In Hitler's paranoid court, being a realist sounded an awful lot like being a traitor.
His rivals in the SS, like Reinhard Heydrich and later Heinrich Himmler, saw the Abwehr as a nest of untrustworthy, old-world aristocrats who lacked true Nazi fervor. They spied on him, monitored his communications, waiting for him to make a mistake. His accurate reports on American industry weren't just dismissed, they were held up as proof that Canaris himself was spreading enemy propaganda, a clear sign of his defeatist attitude. He was trapped. To do his job honestly was to appear disloyal. But Canaris's opposition to the regime went deeper. Horrified by the atrocities being committed by the SS on the Eastern Front, he used the Abwehr's resources to shield members of the German resistance, including the famed theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He secretly worked to keep Franco's Spain from joining the Axis, an act of brilliant sabotage that cost Hitler dearly. The final blow came after the failed July 20th, 1944 plot to assassinate Hitler. In the savage crackdown that followed, the Gestapo investigation uncovered the vast network of opposition within the German military, and many trails led directly back to the Abwehr. Canaris was arrested. His personal diaries were found, revealing the true depth of his disgust and opposition to the Nazi regime. On April 9, 1945, in the final chaotic weeks of the war, the order came directly from a vengeful Hitler. At Flossenburg concentration camp, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, stripped naked, was slowly and brutally strangled to death with piano wire. It was a humiliating, agonizing end for the man who had seen the future with perfect, terrifying clarity. He was murdered by the very regime he had tried to save from its own blindness. He delivered the message, and for his trouble, he was erased. When the guns finally fell silent in May of 1945, the final numbers proved just how right Admiral Canaris had been. The report that landed on his desk in March 1943 wasn't just accurate, it was an understatement. The final tally for Willow Run was simply staggering. At its absolute peak in 1944, the plant was producing a B-24 Liberator not every hour, but every 63 minutes. By the time the last plane rolled off the line, Ford had built 6,972 complete B-24s at Willow Run and produced another 1,893 knockdown kits for assembly elsewhere. Think about that. A single American factory produced more four-engine heavy bombers than the entire German aircraft industry managed during the whole war. It wasn't even close. Across all its factories, the United States produced over 18,400 B-24 Liberators, making it the most produced heavy bomber in history. In total, from 1940 to 1945, the U.S. manufactured over 300,000 military aircraft. Germany, in the same period, produced around 94,000 combat aircraft. The American industrialist William S. Cudnance said it best. "We won because we smothered the enemy in an avalanche of production, the like of which he had never seen nor dreamed possible." The German failure to believe this wasn't a failure of spying. German agents did their job. They got the intel. The failure was a failure of acceptance. It was a total cognitive collapse at the highest levels of command, an inability to process facts that contradicted a fanatical ideology. The Nazi leadership, blinded by their own propaganda about racial superiority, simply could not bring themselves to believe the numbers. They were defeated not by a secret weapon, but by simple arithmetic. They were buried by an avalanche of steel and aluminum forged by the very people they disdained, men and women of all backgrounds working together in a free society. The spies were right.
The Admiral was right. March 17, 1943 was the day the truth arrived in Berlin, and nobody in power was willing to listen. Stories like this show that history often turns on moments far from the battlefield, in quiet offices where a single piece of paper can change everything. If you love uncovering the hidden stories that decided history, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next investigation. It also helps us a lot if you like and share these videos with anyone else who loves a good story. In the end, the story of Willow Run isn't just a cool World War II fact. It's a chilling lesson in how any government, any group, or even any one of us can be blinded by what we want to believe. The Third Reich wasn't defeated for a lack of information. It was defeated because its leaders chose to trust their prejudices over the facts.
They built a worldview on the shifting sands of racial mythology. And when the tide of mathematical reality came crashing in, the entire structure was washed away. The conflict between the Abwehr's grim reports and the arrogant dismissals of Hitler and Göring was a battle for the soul of the German war effort. A battle between evidence and fantasy. Fantasy won, and in doing so, doomed the entire enterprise. Willow Run, meanwhile, stands as a monument to the very things Nazism wanted to destroy. The power of a diverse, free society to mobilize and innovate on a scale that totalitarianism could never match. That factory floor was a microcosm of the Allied cause, a chaotic, sometimes inefficient, but ultimately beautiful mess of humanity that, when united by a common purpose, achieved the impossible. And so, the legacy of that day in March 1943 echoes through time. It's a stark reminder that the most formidable walls aren't made of brick and mortar. They're the ones we build in our own minds.